Hello.
Good morning, Gail Evans in the Republic of South Africa. How are you doing today?
Very well. Good evening, Jeff.
Great to
Nearly
hear.
midnight.
Great to hear from you. And for those of us who don't know about you, please tell us a little bit about yourself. We're going to be talking about the amazing continent of Africa, and specifically the Republic of South Africa and China, and how China is uh, looked upon and working and dealing in that part of the world, because there's a lot of information, both negative and positive, and we're going to try to suss some of that out today. So tell us about yourself, Gail.
Okay, fine, Jeff. I work for thephaser.com. We post news articles from all around the world from independent journalists who we encourage. Thephaser.com is affiliated with SGT Report and also with the Liberty Mill. With the Phaser specifically, we focus more on more international news. SGT Report also does international news, but more local American news. And the Liberty Mill is a wonderful site to go to because they list as many as we can find independent news websites that you can go to that are not controlled by corporate media, that are not controlled by Rupert Murdoch, and are certainly not controlled by Reuters. So we try to give our readers a very wide, diverse viewpoint from many different journalists, and we really look for independent journalists with an independent viewpoint, and specifically on the ground eyewitness. People with experience that can say, look, maybe the newspaper is telling you that, but this is my experience of what's happening here.
Okay, for
So
the
that's you.
for the 44 days fans out there, it is www.thephaser.com, and that's THEPHASER.com, right?
That's correct, and that's how I met you,
Yeah,
Jeff.
exactly. I wrote an article. I think it was on the Saker, the ugly truth behind the great Western Firewall, and you emailed me, and we started a conversation together, and then I can tell everybody out there that I subscribe to the Phaser now since I met you via email, and it is a wonderful, wonderful website to sign up for their email alerts, because they just have a whole range of articles that they aggregate from around the world, from the alternative media and press, and I highly recommend it to all the 44 Days listeners out there. It is a wonderful, wonderful way to stay in touch with the world and get the unvarnished truth.
Well, thanks for that, Jeff. And, we were very happy to find you because, we get very little information from inside China from a perspective of somebody who's living in China, especially from a perspective of somebody who's living in Beijing.
Yeah.
So
Well,
this
thank
is
you.
wonderful. It's a two-way street, and you certainly give out a lot of information that we don't know, and this certainly does not appear in our media. So it's wonderful to have you, and I'm really happy to have met you.
Likewise. Well,
So here
listen,
we
let's go
go.
ahead and get started on China and Africa. I sent you 5 questions ranging from, investments in in RSA or Africa by the Chinese. Who are the parties? Businesses, physical presence of the Chinese in RSA society, trade between RSA and China. Most popular products going both ways. Have the Chinese bought into any RSA metal or diamond mines, and any information you have on that? And then also the BRICS bank, the BRICS group, etc., the consciousness of BRICS. the people in the Republic of South Africa, and how do they feel about being the smallest economy and the smallest country in that group. I would like for everybody out there to know that I actually, although it's old, I actually know South Africa very, very well. From 1982 to 1985, I was in agricultural marketing in Africa, and I traveled all over the continent. I visited 20-something countries in Africa, and RSA was one of my biggest markets, and so I drove all over South Africa, including, I think you're from Durban, right?
Yep, I'm in Durban.
You're in Durban, and including Durban, and of course this was during apartheid, so it was much different, but the people were wonderful. The country is spectacularly beautiful, and because I was in agriculture, specifically dairy production, I was really able to get out into and beef production. I was able to get out into into the four corners of the country and really see the place beyond the big cities, and so I have a great love and affection for South Africa. So let's get started. What would you like to tell us about just
Right,
one of those questions?
I think let's just start from the top, because you wanted to know about the physical presence of Chinese in South Africa.
Yeah.
So I will give you for your listeners, I will just give you a quick brief history of Chinese presence in South Africa. Apparently, the first Chinese that came to South Africa, can you believe it, which I didn't know until you asked, was in 1660.
Wow.
The Dutch East India Company brought them over to start vegetable farming in Cape Town. Because Cape Town was basically a watering hole for the Dutch East India Company that was sailing from Europe around South Africa and to the east. Of course, this was before the days of the Suez Canal. Wow. So that was the first Chinese. And then the next major Chinese that came to South Africa was when gold was discovered in South Africa in the 1860s, 1870s, round about there. But they had a problem because, you see, apartheid existed before apartheid. Well, let's just call it racism.
You're racist.
They wouldn't allow the Chinese to own land. They wouldn't allow them to actually have mining rights. So the Chinese, even if they came here and they explored, they couldn't own a mine, right? The best they could do was work for somebody on a mine. So the Chinese, contrary to what everybody thinks, because everybody's been so brainwashed that the Chinese are communist, contrary to what everybody thinks, I think they are some of the best capitalists on the planet. They did the next best thing, and they went into retail, and they opened up little shops all over the place. And the Chinese community has grown in retail. And then the next big story, of course, that happens with the Chinese community was during apartheid, when the national government took over, the Nationalist Party took over. And during apartheid, of course, they had the Group Areas Act, where if you were black, you had to live in a certain area. If you were white,
the townships.
Townships. This happened after the Second World War, when apartheid was instituted. But they had a bit of a problem with the Chinese. They didn't know where to put them, you see.
They weren't white, they weren't black.
So
they were yellow.
Yes, so they decided that they would put the Chinese with the coloreds.
Yeah, the colored group, yeah.
We have what we call...
The Indians.
No, not the Indians.
Oh, not even the Indians.
Okay. In South Africa, the coloreds are actually their own ethnicity, if you could call it that.
Yeah.
So the colored community are basically Cape Malay, originally. Cape Malay also by the Dutch East India Company from Malaysia. And they're a combination of white, Malay, Khoi, and San, Bushmen.
Unbelievable. So the Indians had their own classification.
Indians had their own. The Indians lived in their own areas.
Oh, I didn't
The
know that. I
whites
thought
lived
they
in
were the
their.
coloreds.
Oh, no, 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 no. If you were Indian, you did not live in a colored area. You lived in an Indian area.
Ah, okay.
So, and then we have the coloreds that, especially in the Cape. The Cape is mainly where a lot of coloreds live. I think the coloreds are probably more South African than anybody else in this country. So they decided to put the Chinese with the coloreds.
Interesting.
Which is, with this Group Areas Act, the thing is people lost their homes. A Chinese family that was living in a very nice home. I mean, the same thing happened with the Indian community. Same thing happened with the black community. You suddenly lost your homes. You were ripped out of your homes, and you were told where you were allowed to live.
It was almost like forced collectivization.
Forced. So, some people who were doing very well off and had very, very nice homes suddenly lost their homes, and they were put into these areas that were poorer areas, and it was very unpleasant for them, amongst which was the Chinese. So they were now decided they would be colored until because South Africa was totally anti-communist, they supported Taiwan. So we started.
I remember that.
This started happening in the 70s. So they started major trade deals with Taiwan, and of course now we end up with a Taiwanese embassy in South Africa, and now we have a problem because where are the Taiwanese going to live? Because with all these trade deals, we now had an influx of Taiwanese people coming to live in South Africa. So it created an embarrassment because you couldn't allow the Taiwanese to live in white areas and the Taiwanese ambassador to live in white areas.
Oh, my God.
But the South African Chinese, who are South African, for goodness sake. So how they resolved the issue was they decided that if you were Chinese and you earned above a certain income a month, then you were allowed to live in a white area. It's insane.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of Palestine with the Israelis. Force collectivizing and kicking out Palestinians from their homes where they lived for thousands of years, and moving them out and destroying their towns and villages, and this is the way empire works.
Yes, well, it's exactly the same kind of situation. So what the South African Chinese community did, which I think was very clever, and they're very, very supportive of each other, we didn't have all these takeaway Chinese restaurants, right? We didn't. But what they did was they decided to open up top quality, top class Chinese restaurants, which they did. And they opened them up in major hotels, especially international hotels. And they opened them up in major shopping centers. So, it became quite fashionable if you wanted to go out for a really nice night out.
Like a Chinese meal.
You would go out for a Chinese meal, but a Chinese meal was certainly not considered a cheap meal. It was a really good evening out with incredible food, and they really did. The Chinese restaurants were top class, top standard. And so they moved from retail into the restaurant business, and as a result, we have got some very, very good Chinese restaurants in South Africa.
That's amazing.
And then from there, they started, next door to the main Chinese restaurant, they'd have takeaway. So you could get takeaway if you wanted to, and you didn't want to come into the restaurant. So that's how the South African Chinese community got out of the colored area and ended up living in the white area. But I'll tell you a funny story. I had a Chinese friend. The reason why I know all this was because I had Chinese friends at school. We were in boarding school, and that's another thing that happened, you see. what the Chinese community did was the same thing worked with the schools, right? You either went to a colored school, a black school, a white school, an Indian school. You
Oh
know,
no.
you didn't mix at school. So what they did was, and a lot of them at great cost to the Chinese families, the only schools they could put their children in were in private English boarding schools, English-speaking boarding schools.
Wow.
So at great sacrifice, a lot of Chinese families put their children through highly expensive English-speaking boarding schools so that they could go to a white school. So that is where I met my Chinese friends. However, me being totally non-compass mentis and not fully understanding the situation, I said, well, when am you going to invite me to come home with you? And they kept, how polite the Chinese are.
Yeah.
Very polite, dodge the question, there we go. And eventually I won. So, not knowing what on earth I was getting myself into, this Chinese friend of mine, her parents owned a Chinese restaurant in one of the best suburbs in Pretoria. But anyway, so her brother comes to fetch us at school. We get in the car and off we go. I've got no idea where I'm going. And we get off to the turn-off where she lives. And she says to me, lie down on the back seat of the car. I said, what are you talking about? She says, just lie down on the back seat of the car. And she covers me with a blanket.
Oh my gosh.
We drive into the suburb, and he drives up to the house. He drives right up to the kitchen door, opens the back car door, opens the kitchen door, and they said to me, right, walk into the kitchen, but duck. I duck, I walk into the kitchen. Eventually I said, will you please tell me what this is all about? They said, do you know where you are? I said, I don't have a clue. They said, you're in Danville. Danville was a colored suburb in Pretoria. They still had to reach the monthly income level for them to move out of Danville into the white suburb where they were running their very fancy Chinese restaurant. So they were still forced to live in the colored area. But the thing is, if the police had caught us, all right, I most probably would have got off. My friend would have got off. But her brother would have been locked up in jail because it was illegal for me as a white person not only to be in a colored area, but to be in a home in a colored area.
Oh my gosh. What year was this approximately, Gail?
1976.
1976, okay. Wow.
I mean, if we had got caught, I reckon the cops would have thrown the book at him. He would have most probably been charged with abduction and goodness knows what. It would have caused the most terrible trouble. So for them to take me home was a big sacrifice on their part,
That's amazing.
I only realized, but you know how polite the Chinese are. So I only realized what trouble I had actually caused afterwards. So there you go. That's one instance of apartheid. And then, of course, apartheid ends, and then after 1994, that's the other thing I must tell you is that the old Chinese South African community are mainly Cantonese.
Guangdong. Yeah, for our listeners out there, that is the province just north of Hong Kong, in this very, very southern part of the country, and they're known for their industriousness and business acumen and hard work, and they are that's where Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, got the idea to put in the special economic zones, and Shenzhen, and the rest is history. And that still is today the economic engine of much of southern China.
Highly intelligent people, incredibly polite people, incredible sense of humor. This wonderful, witty, sharp sense of humor. I really enjoyed their company. Honestly, I did. It was an eye-opener for me as a child, to suddenly be exposed to this Chinese community. I mean, later I was invited to the Chinese club, so I met a lot of South African Chinese. And they don't particularly like the Chinese from the north at all.
They don't like each other here either.
Yeah, so, to put it politely, they regard the Chinese from the north as barbaric.
Yeah. The feeling is mutual.
Yeah, so, there's this. So then, this is where you ask. So, of course, now after 1994, apartheid goes, and what happens? South Africa now starts making friends with mainland China, and Taiwan was most upset because they felt like South Africa had now dumped them. And of course, now you've got mainland Chinese coming into South Africa. So now we also have this split Chinese community here, Jeff.
Yeah, well, that's not unusual. Because they don't really like each other. Well, first off, they speak a different language. They don't. The Northerners speak Mandarin, and the Southerners speak Cantonese, and they're like two different people. I mean, China's a continent-sized country. It's kind of like comparing someone from South Africa to Libya. I mean, they're not the same people. I mean, they're Chinese, but they're very, very different psychologically and historically and philosophically.
Yeah. So that's basically the story about the Chinese community, the history of the Chinese community in South Africa. They have contributed to this country amazingly. They've since got out of retail. They're into medicine and law and you name it. They really have been a great boon to this country.
Now, for the other ethnic groups in South Africa, I mean, is there any resentment, or we hear about all these cases around the world where there will be flare-ups and attacks on Chinese merchants and shops and things which are let's be honest, are often precipitated by Western intelligence, the CIA, MI6, etc., to foment destabilization and trying to overthrow the government or imbalance the make their lives miserable for them. Has that happened in South Africa against the Chinese?
Well, it hasn't happened during the apartheid years. Yes, you would find that, all right. But with the local South African Chinese, they really are South African, Jeff.
Yeah.
Seriously, if you closed your eyes, you would be talking to a South African. So. But the resentment has come in, and there's great fear and resentment from mainland Chinese coming into South Africa. A lot of South Africans don't like it. And also, because a lot of it has been associated as well with human trafficking and prostitution.
Yeah.
And also with money laundering through drugs and the Chinese triads. So that has given it a very nasty flavor. That's the underside of it. And a lot of people resent the Chinese coming here from mainland China and, as they say in South Africa, opening up all these little shops. They come here and they open up all these little shops. But the thing is, and then in the same breath, they're communists. But the thing is, they're the biggest capitalists you've ever met in your life. Yeah. Because the first thing they do when they come here is they don't expect the government to give them a job. They don't expect the big corporations and the retail stores to give them a job. They come here, they don't expect anybody to give them a job. They come here, and as they say, they open up all these little shops, and they start their own businesses.
And they live upstairs, and they work 18 hours a day.
That's right, 24 hours a day, literally they open up these shops, and they live, eat, and sleep in these shops.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
They work very, very hard. I don't think there will be any resentment, providing not too many of them come.
Yeah.
So it hasn't. ended up being a very big problem. But, you know, the same thing goes for the Indian community now. You know, the Indian community are South African, and the Indian community came out here because they brought them out here to cut sugarcane.
Yeah.
Also talking in the 1800s. So, but now you end up with Indians coming here from India thinking they can make their fortune. And even in South African Indian community is resentful because
of these new. Well, look at the United States. I mean, you know, every time there's a wave of immigration, even if they're the same skin color or the ethnicity, there's all this resentment. They completely forget that it was their parents and grandparents who came, you know, 50 and 100 years ago, you know, that allowed them to be there.
Well, what really got everybody's noses up was we ended up with this family called Gupta that came to South Africa in the 90s. And they have got a lot of money. They're very good friends with Jacob Zuma. And they've thrown their weight around.
Yeah.
Nobody likes it. They are behaving like they own the country.
Yeah, that's not good.
The biggest mistake they made was they had a wedding. And they flew in all these people from India, but what they did was they had the cheek to find a few loopholes and land their planes not at Johannesburg International Airport. They decided that they would use our military airport in Pretoria because it was safer and it was closer to Sun City. So they landed all their guests from India at our supposedly secure military airport base for their wedding party, and the whole country was up in arms and, you know, being very anti-Indian. Even the Indians were furious about it.
Yeah, well, it's just like this. It's the 1% lording it over the 99%.
The thing is, you know, everybody else here has worked.
It transcends race.
Yeah, the thing is, every single South African in this country, we've been through a lot. As you know, you were here in the 80s.
Oh, absolutely.
It was not a pretty picture. The riots were not pretty. South Africans have been through a lot. All races have been through a lot. So when you have an outsider coming here, it doesn't matter what race they are, what religion they are, what language that they speak. You must know that South Africans have been through a lot. So you mustn't just walk in here and start throwing your money around and thinking that you can own the place. You know, you've got to earn it. You've really got to earn it, and you've got to earn people's respect. Because we've been through a lot. So, you know, don't come here with your flashy cars and your flashy diamonds. And especially...
And your flashy weddings.
And your flashy weddings and land at our airports.
In a secured military airport.
Yeah, a secured military airport. And also, you know, we've still got a very big poverty problem. We've got a large poverty problem here.
Yeah.
We've got a very big unemployment problem. And we've got real poverty. And it's really bad manners to sit there and flash. You know, when there's all these people that don't have work. You know, there's people that don't have enough to eat. We've still got a housing problem. There are people without homes. We've still got people without electricity, without water. We've still got people without sewage facilities.
In the old townships.
You know, so it doesn't work. It might work to go flash in India, even though you have extreme poverty levels, and people will put up with it. But don't come and flash here. Yeah. You know, when you've got this extreme poverty, at least have some manners about it. You know, nobody minds you working hard and making money and being a success, but be aware that not everybody.
Show some humility.
Show some humility. And if you don't, as you know, we've recently had this big xenophobia.
Yeah, with the Mozambicans.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. People are getting fed up because, you know, as it is, we've got high unemployment. And then we've got all these people from all over Africa coming here. And when we when you can't house your own people, educate your own people, and employ your own people, it's very unwise to let other people come flooding through your borders, because then it creates great anger and resentment.
Yeah.
So I do understand the perspective of the people who are angry, because they're still sitting there without jobs, without work,
Without water, without electricity.
without electricity. But you let it, and the way they see it is all these people are coming in and taking their jobs.
Yeah.
So at the moment, no, people are worried about the Chinese coming here, and for valid reasons. And you can't say that it's a racist reason either, because, they are just as worried about Mozambicans coming here.
Yeah.
I'm sure if a flood of Americans had to come here tomorrow, they'd feel exactly the same way.
Yeah.
So, it's not a racial issue, really. It's an economic issue.
Economic issue. Well, it's the same thing in the United States. Starting in the 1980s, the 1% had enough of sharing a tiny bit of their wealth from the Depression through World War II and the 60s and 70s, and they wanted it all back, all 110%. And so starting in the 80s, of course, the debt and the personal